issues. I think this will be another very interesting topic to us. Mark is a readability consultant in Golden Valley, Minnesota. He received in 1973 his PhD, which is in experimental psychology from the University of Pittsburgh. He's researched the readability of consent forms, HIPAA notices, and patient bill of rights. He has 124 presentations and 215 publications. For 21 years, Mark's been an IRB member at North Memorial Medical Center in Robbinsdale, Minnesota. He's consulted with 21 law firms and has testified as an expert witness on the readability, legibility, and comprehension of consumer agreements. I'm sure many of you, most of you, have seen his articles in the SOCRA Journal. So thank you, Mark, for joining us.
My topic is e-consent, or electronic consent, and yes, with 21 years on an IRB, I have read more consent forms than I can probably count. But the times are changing, and one of the ways they are changing is that there is an effort to move the consent form from pieces of paper to tablets or smartphones even, and so I brought mine up here just to do an illustration. Some people have suggested putting a consent form on a smartphone. Seriously. And if you think about the size of the smartphone and the number of words in a consent form, something I'll come back to in a little while, you realize what an incredible challenge that will be. I've worked on a couple of e-consent projects, one with clinical patients that involved, they had to sign a consent form to share their health information in a health information exchange so that clinics in the community would all have access to their medical information. And the second was a federally consulted with a federal agency to review HIPAA notices that were developed for mobile devices. This was for treatment HIPAA notices, not research HIPAA notices. And one of the things I've learned is what seems to work and what really probably won't work. If you are more interested in this, it's in the May issue of SOCRA Source. This is sort of a summary of what I did in that article. The current issue of SOCRA Source, the August issue, I have an article on measuring consent comprehension in e-consent trials, which I won't have time to get into, but if you're interested, you can track e-consent usability and e-consent comprehension. Paper consent is not the same as e-consent. The manner in which it is delivered is completely different. And one of the frustrations I've seen on our IRB, if I'm reading a consent form in paper and I want to find the risk section, I can kind of flip back and forth on the pages pretty quickly to find it. We have some physicians who keep everything on their tablet or their iPad or their laptop or whatever. They can't flip back and forth. They have to scroll back and forth. And it takes a lot more time to even find information on a device. Some of this comes from FDA's recent draft guidance, which they were clear, don't cite this, it's for comment purposes only. So I'm citing something in a way that shouldn't be cited, so don't say you heard it here. One of the issues they've raised, because some of the e-consent trials, in trying to modernize the e-consent process and put it on a device, they've added little video scenarios, doctors talking to patients, illustrations, cartoons, maybe 30-second clips that patients can see and not just have to read. The FDA currently is thinking about if you do e-consent, the thinking is you still have to give patients a paper copy of everything that was covered in the e-consent needs to be on paper. And the issue is, how do you provide transcriptions of the audio and the video on paper that will keep its integrity with the original electronic version? And so one of the issues they are trying to think their way through is, if you do e-consent and you require a paper version be provided, Do you have to include everything in the e-consent, or do you only have to include part of it? So that's one of the problems in distinguishing paper consent from electronic consent. Here's where I've been interested in usability issues for a very long time. If you're not familiar with usability using electronic devices, computers, tablets, phones, whatever, go online and just do a search on usability research, and you will find there have been people, many of them, Apple was particularly good at this in developing devices that people found easier to use. One of the concerns I have is that I know from the literature that the average adult reads at about 250 words per minute. If you're a really poor reader, you may be down to 200 words a minute or even less. Now, when you consider some consent forms, some of the longer ones that I've reviewed are 12,000 words. You're looking at about an hour for an average reader to read through that. Some of the really long consent forms, and I've heard of these, but I've never seen them. I think the longest consent form I've ever seen personally has been 30 single-spaced pages. If you put it on a device, usability researchers know that reading speed on a device is slower than reading speed on paper that's in front of you, maybe 6 to 11% slower. So it will take subjects more time to read through an e-consent than it would take them to read that same e-consent if it was on paper. Plus, you add the time that's involved. Maybe it's another minute or 2 or 5 minutes to go through these videos, or in some cases to hit replay and replay the videos again. So e-consent may not save any time over the actual informed consent. Some of the studies that I've reviewed, and there haven't been that many of them, the people who have developed the e-consent, in my mind, seem to not understand the consent process. What they do is they give people the device, and they essentially put them in a room with the device, and here's what it comes down to. Go consent yourself. There's no involvement of a researcher explaining the consent form until the very end. And it really is a fundamental shift in what we think we know about the consent process and the conversation between the researcher and the prospective subject. If you put it on a device, it's unclear what is going to be the role of the investigator in their conversation with the prospective subjects. I'm putting on my psychology hat again. We all have a limited working memory. Over the short term, we can remember about 4 to 7 items before our working memory gets completely overloaded. Consent forms, on the other hand, can be very long, over 20 pages. Some will have 25 to 50 separate topics. What do I mean by 25 to 50 separate topics? You've got 8 requirements, 8 or 9 required elements. You've got the optional elements. You've got HIPAA elements. We now see consent forms that include a pharmacogenetic, a pharmacokinetic sub-study, and sometimes even a plan for future research studies. I just counted up the number of topic headings over the various paragraphs to come up with that, to get some idea, what's the cognitive load? How much do people have to remember when they're going through the consent process and the consent form? And so here's the problem. Your brain can remember 4 to 7 pieces of information, but you're given 20 to 50. There's a mismatch there somewhere. I'm not sure how all of that information will be presented on a device. I don't know, and one of the problems is the studies that have been done have used sort of hypothetical studies. They haven't used real consent forms from real studies. So in my way of thinking, it's not a really good representative sample. If you have a 20-page consent form, the research I've done on single-spaced consent forms, they average about 380 words per page on paper. How many screens will it take for a 20-page paper consent form if you do a word-for-word translation? You just move it from paper to a tablet screen, and tablet screens are getting bigger, or a smartphone screen, and the screens are getting bigger, it's not going to be 20 screens. You're not going to get 380 words on a tablet screen. They're too small for that, and people can't deal with that much information. What will people do if they have to scroll through 40 or 50 or 60 screens? It's bad enough with 20 single-spaced pages. The screen count gets so high that I think people will just simply give up because it won't be usable for them. Let me give you an example of usability that you may have experienced in your own life if this is kind of new to you. I use Microsoft Windows on my computer, and I've enjoyed using Windows 7 a lot. And when Windows 8 came out, it was, I think most people would agree, pretty much a catastrophic disaster for Microsoft because people found it to not be usable. They couldn't figure out how to do the things they had been used to doing on Windows 7. Microsoft found it so unusable that they've now come out with Windows 10. They didn't want to call it 9 because that was too close to Windows 8. This is what I get from reading computer magazines online. So they called it Windows 10 so people would feel that the two were not really connected. One of the unique things that you all have to deal with in clinical trial studies is the age of the subjects. The consent forms that I see often say something like, the age of the subjects will range from 18 to no upper limit. So let's say you may have some subjects well into their 90s. You're dealing with maybe a 75-year age range from people who are very high-tech because they've grown up with it, and you may see this in your own family with parents or grandparents or people that you know who are in their 70s or 80s or 90s, for whom technology is still a mystery. They can't use it, they can't figure out how to use it. Friends of ours had their parents visiting them one summer. And they both went out and they came back and they discovered that their parents could not figure out how to make coffee on the programmable coffee maker. They couldn't figure out the microwave or the stove because it all took programming skills that they did not have. When you're dealing with a wide age range as you are, it's pretty much got to work for everybody. And as I'm getting older and dealing with my own memory and cognitive and other kind of changes, I don't know whether an e-consent process that works with young people will work the same way with older people. You also have a problem with manual dexterity and vision, and we found this out in one of the trials that I mentioned, or one of the studies that I mentioned earlier. We were trying to do an e-consent process with HIPAA notices. So the company I was working with got several clinics to participate, and they put all the consent forms on an iPad, and they had the HIPAA notices on the iPad, and they tried to really simplify it so that the patients, mostly in clinics, most of whom were Medicare patients, so that they had to do a minimal amount of interaction with the screen. They used sliders for volume and for scrolling. And part of the problem is older patients don't always have great eye-hand coordination. Maybe they've got cataracts. Maybe they've got sort of hand tremors. The kind of touch reaction that you can do on a device is almost impossible for some older people to do. They just can't use the device in the way it's designed to be used. And one of the things we discovered was when we asked these patients how they wanted to get their HIPAA information, almost none of them said a device. Most of them said, I want to get that information by talking to my doctor about it. So they were very resistant to using a device to get HIPAA information. The other thing is I've sort of alluded to is that when you're working with a device, it's not like flipping pages. You have to scroll forwards and backwards. For some people, that is going to be a challenge they just can't overcome, especially if there are a lot of screens they have to go back and forth to try to find information. This is something out of psychology and usability research. the people who are developing Econsent and using it need to understand there's a difference between remembering information, where your brain can just recall something you've read, maybe even the setting in which you remember it, versus knowing it, things that you know, but you don't know where you learned it from. You just have that knowledge. And early research suggests that people who have read from computer monitors rely more on remembering, and those who rely on paper rely on memory and knowing. The point is, people process information differently whether they're reading it on paper or reading it on a device. The two procedures in no means are the same to the way your brain has to deal with them. Cognitive overload. This is one of my favorite topics because I see it everywhere, where our brains are simply given more information than we can possibly deal with. Dan Kahneman is one of the few psychologists to win a Nobel Prize, and he did it for his work on judgment and decision making. And he has a book, the references, you can find it in the SOCRA article. Kahneman came out with what he called the law of least effect. If there are several ways to reach a goal, people will pick the least demanding way. We want to get done with a task as quickly as possible, not as slowly as possible, which is one of the things that can be so incredibly frustrating when you're using an electronic device and it doesn't do what you want it to do. I suspect that what some people will do is that they will get a device and they'll start reading the consent form and they'll say, oh, the hell with this, and they'll go to the signature page and digitally sign it and simply give up reading it because it's going to take too much effort, too much time, too much mental energy. There have been some studies which won't allow you to do that. They force you to go through the whole consent form, every screen, before you get to the end. My prediction is if somebody doesn't throw the device against a wall and walk out, that's not the way people process information. So people will have problems navigating screens. The menus will be unfamiliar. The way it looks on a screen will be so different from what you see on paper. And let me add the point, this is something I had done for a SOCRA article a couple of years ago titled, "Can Sick Patients Understand Informed Consent?" And I dug through the literature to find as many examples as I can, but sick patients, depending on their illness, depending on maybe the medication that they're on, depending on the kind of treatment that they're on. For example, women who have received chemotherapy for breast cancer have talked about chemo brain, the way their memory is affected, and it's a real phenomenon, and there is good evidence behind that. It's easy to forget that in many clinical trials, you are dealing with patients who are really sick. They may have been given every treatment that exists and none of them work. They may be sick because of the illness. They may be experiencing side effects from their drugs, and their stress level and anxiety level may be up to here. That doesn't make understanding a consent form any easier, given the kind of task you have to go through to do it. One of our next door neighbor, who we had known for many years, the husband was diagnosed with idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, and he was terminally ill. They were in their 70s. They were recruited for a clinical trial at the University of Minnesota, and so they went in, the husband and wife, to talk to the researcher and to enroll him into the trial. They were just hoping that he would get the right drug. And so I was talking to them one day, and I asked them about their experience in the consent process. And the wife said, oh yeah, the researcher who explained that to us, he was really good, and I'm happy to know, she said, there's no placebo in this trial. And the husband said, yes, there is. So you have two people who went through the exact same consent process. One came out no placebo, the other one heard there was a placebo. People, when they're sick and stressed and scared, will process information in a variety of ways. One of the things we understand about people who are poor readers, low health literacy skills, if you will, or people who don't read at a very high reading level, One of the ways they compensate for that is to go back and reread what they've already read. They may read the same sentence over 2 or 3 times because, especially if it's a long sentence, they forget the beginning of the sentence by the time they get to the end of the sentence. So rereading will add time to the process if people are really conscientious and trying to work their way through it. There are issues with device and connection problems. One of the Econsent studies found about 20% of the subjects had technical devices that did not work the way they were supposed to. They would touch it and nothing would happen. They would scroll it and nothing would happen. The wireless connection or the wired connection got lost. And I don't hear this as much as I used to hear it, but people would tell me when they were just getting involved with computers, I'm afraid if I do something wrong, I'll break it. And I would say that to them, you don't know enough to break it. You can't break it using the keyboard and the mouse. You physically cannot do that. But people who are confronted with a new device that they've never seen before, they don't understand how it works. Some will assume that if I don't do this right, or if something goes wrong, they think, oh, I broke it, now I'm in trouble, and it goes on and on and on. So if you're going to use Econsent, have a backup process in place, because at some point the Econsent process, because of electronic problems, communication problems, wireless problems, something won't work, and what do you do when the person has a dead device in their hand? And I saw that occasionally happened in one of the studies that I was involved with. Text density is an issue. How many words can you fit on a page? Now, the consent forms tend to be single-spaced, although you could use 1.5 spaces or double spacing. You get maybe an average, I said, of about 380 words per page. Some of the legal consulting that I've done, you know what those dense blocks of texts look like. I've seen as many as 900 words on a page, and that's really cramped. So there needs to be some consideration as to the number of words that will fit on a page, how many screens are needed, and the usability expert needs to pay some serious attention to things like the font family that you're using, because what shows up fine on paper doesn't carry over to the screen, the font size, the screen size, the resolution. It really has to be optimized for legibility. People have to be able to see the words and sentences before they can read them and understand them. How many people here ever read through the complete privacy notice and terms of service that you see from a website? Nobody. I do that because I have fun running it through my readability software, pointing out how none of this is understandable to the average person. Microsoft recently came out with a revised version, I think it was of their privacy notice and their terms of service, which they claimed was much more readable. And a lot of the people who were writing for computer magazines, high-tech people, said it was pretty good. I went through it, and just to give you one statistic, I cut and pasted it from the screen and put it into Microsoft Word and did a word count. If you wanted to read their new, revised, easy to read, easy to understand privacy policy and terms of service, it was 60,000 words. 60,000. Now, even if it's written at a hypothetical 6th grade reading level, which it was not, you still got 60,000 words that your brain has to process. Most of these studies have used iPads for a variety of reasons. And I think one of the things you run into is researchers tend to assume, well, I use an iPad, doesn't everybody? Not everyone owns an iPad, and these are the latest statistics that I was able to come up with in terms of market share before I sent the slides in. Apple has about 27% of the market. So roughly 1 out of 4 tablets that's sold is an Apple iPad. Samsung has 20%, 54% is other. And so you have a lot of people using devices that are not Apple. And the question is, if you're using an Android device, how well do the usability skills that you have on your Android device translate to an iPad device? There may be some real discrepancies. As an IRB member, I worry about this because if you have an e-consent form, if you put it on a tablet's going to have a certain size screen and resolution. If you put it on an Android device, are they going to be comparable? And as an IRB member, how many mobile devices am I going to need to have to review a study that's doing e-consent? And what I mean by that is it's one thing if you get paper. Everybody can read the paper, but if we have a study that involves e-consent and the researcher comes in, we need to see what the consent looks like on the device, not on how it's printed out. I don't happen to own an iPad. Is the hospital going to buy me one? The technology between the developers of e-consent and the users, either the prospective subjects or IRBs, there are going to be some real interesting challenges down the road. I don't want to see a consent form that's blown up on a screen this big in our IRB conference room. I want to see what the subject is going to see. The digital divide. This is 2013 census data, which of course is ancient history by now, the way information changes on the internet. But in US Census data, which in some ways is the best data we can get because it's comprehensive around the country, a lot of people own computers. Only about 74% of those who own computers use the internet. About 2/3 owned a smartphone or wireless computer. There are a lot of people out there, especially in rural areas, who cannot get Wi-Fi, who are still doing telephone connections because that's all they have available. The census data shows that people who use the internet and computers tend to be younger, more Asian and white, highly educated, higher incomes in metropolitan areas. And when I look at the e-consent studies, and there haven't been many of them, that's the population that they're doing their e-consent studies on, which is the most educated, affluent, high-tech users of computers. I want them to go into a community where people are older, not Asian or white, high school graduates in rural areas. You will get completely different results, I suspect, because the populations, the sampling, the methodology is not the same. So what I want to leave you all with is please don't assume that everyone is as technologically sophisticated as you are. Expect to have people, if you do e-consent, who will be more confused than you can imagine. Thank you.
Do we have any questions? I have one question. Thank you very much, Mark. Really appreciate that. That was very informative. Some things I've not thought about. Do you anticipate that there are going to be specific guidelines for doing e-consents, whether they're institutionally based or federal agency based?
I think there will have to be some federal guidelines. If it's institutionally based, every institution will have their own standards. Mm-hmm. There's got to be some standardization for how this is going to be done. My concern is that the technology is moving so quickly. I just saw a piece of data before I came here. Somebody's estimated that there are already 162,000 mobile health applications. Given the federal regulatory process, technology is moving at the speed of light and federal regulators are moving at the speed of sound. It's just, the federal regulators will always be years to a decade behind.
Yeah. Okay, thank you so much, Mark. Thanks very much. Can I hold your question till we finish our last presentation and then come up afterwards?
Sure.
Are you a little bit short in your time? Yeah, sure. Okay, there's time. Go ahead.
Okay. I just wanted to point out that with good clinical practice and what you do anyway for a good informed consent, would still be used when you do an e-consent. That person is going to get a copy of that informed consent in a good amount of time before. They're going to review it with their family and their friends. You're then going to call them and ask them, you know, did you go over your informed consent? What questions do you have? They don't see it the first time it shows up, or at least they shouldn't. And then you're going to ask them when they show up at your door, hey, did you read it? Did you have any questions? You have no questions for me? Great. Tell me what induced pluripotent stem cells are. So, you know, it's an interaction, and it's a process, and it continues. It's not just signing the consent.
Absolutely. Mark?
Except if you read the studies that have been done on e-consent, they're not doing it the way you've suggested and the way we know consent should be done.
Should be done.
They're bypassing all of it. They want to demonstrate the efficacy of the e-consent on a device. The whole process has been ignored, which I find scary.
I can hardly wait till it hits NIH.